Before we start, I just want to remind you all that while I have worked with the developers a ton on this game, I'm not actually a developer. I'm just the lead level designer and a very prominent community member. With that out of the way, let's hop right into this, shall we? The inventory is a mechanic which, if enabled by the map creator, allows players to place their own tracks and build their own routes in a timetable map. At a first glance, this seems like an insanely innovative concept. And don't get me wrong, it can be. It can really provide unique opportunities and interesting conflict and challenge to players that we've never seen before. There's just one problem. Nobody stopped to think about how fun this mechanic would actually be until it was so far into development that it wasn't worth canceling anymore. Don't get me wrong, the potential is amazing, but the results aren't. So today, I'd like to talk about 4 different stages of the inventory. I want to talk about why we thought it would work, why it hasn't worked, how it can work, and how it will work. The past, the present, the possibilities, and the planned. Honestly, I don't fully know why we thought this would ever work. It was a cool concept on paper. It seemed to be a nice way to bridge the gap between timetable and endless, allowing players to create their own track layout while the trains are still set in stone and you're trying to keep to a timetable. Games have done this before. Well, not with timetables, not with something like this, but an old game that did this before was 3D Ultra Lionel Train Town, of all things in the world, and that wasn't that bad, honestly. That was fun. So, another game's already done it back in the day, right? So why wouldn't it work here? After all, we're only adding new ideas. All of the creators who had been contacted about this idea had shown good promise. Myself included, I thought it was a good idea at the time. But obviously, something didn't work. What was that something, and why are we here now? In order to understand why the inventory falls flat, we need to understand what makes timetable good and what makes endless good. After all, the inventory is a new tool for timetable maps and is trying to bridge the gap between timetable and endless. And while we're at it, we should also look at quote-unquote game modes based on these other modes that people don't like playing because of how extreme they are. If we can determine the benefits from timetable and endless, and the problems, the issues with the other 2 modes, we should be able to identify what the problem is with the inventory, right? So let's start our journey at the mode that is trying to become endless. What makes endless fun? Well, there are so many answers to that question that answering them in a video about the inventory would be ridiculous. But a few answers are the creativity of being able to build your own railroad, the challenge of doing it in a tight space, the expansion and the growth that you get to experience as you build out through your map, player rewards as upgrades that allow you to run your system better. But personally, I think the core thing is the fine balance between accepting new contracts to expand your system, building new tracks based off of the money you've earned, and buying new upgrades off of the research that you've earned so that you can run more trains and continue the cycle. This is great because it means you're never stuck doing one thing for such a long time that it becomes boring. That's one of the first places that the inventory can easily fail. If the player needs to build too many tracks, they might be spending too much time building the tracks rather than running the trains. And if you know timetable is a game mode, it's very arcadey. You jump in, you play the level, there's no setup, no nothing, you just try and beat the challenge as best you can. But the inventory adds that extra layer of setup, and that can be infuriating. And it's not like this is speculation either. Remember how I mentioned there were two pseudo game modes that people dislike? Well, let's bring them up now. Those game modes are known as pre-baked and automatic. Pre-baked is a variant of endless where all the tracks are already in place, but the trains aren't, and it's up to you to add them. Because the tracks are already there, one of the three major phases of endless is missing. The track building part, expansion. Instead, all you can really do is accept new contracts and keep adding more trains to the system and get upgrades to make it slightly better, but in the end, you're spending so much effort for such a small reward that it's not really worth it. After all, it's not really your creative track layout anymore, and that's the reason that Endless is fun, because you get to make something personalized, and pre-built strips the personality from it and also adds way too much effort all at once, as you have to keep adding more and more and more and more trains. It becomes tedious and it's not very fun. On the other end of the spectrum are automatic levels. All the tracks are in place, all the trains are ready, but there's a bunch of sensors everywhere and there's so much track and so many trains that you basically have to use them. But automatic levels still have the same problems as pre-baked endless, and that is required player setup. The problem here is that it takes so long to set up all the sensors that by the time you're finished, if you missed something a long time ago and you get penalized because of it, how are you going to remember what that was? You're not, because the game's response was not immediate. Whether it be a reward or a penalty, there was a severe disconnect between the player action that caused the response from the game. And that's the main problem with the inventory. The response from the game, the reward or the penalties, whichever it is disconnected from the player action so severely that it's hard to identify what the problem was. This can either be because the player spent all their time at the beginning of the map building the tracks, and so the penalty only comes far later in the level when they've finally finished building and they start running the trains, or it can be because they don't actually know what connections are necessary because they did not design the timetable themselves. The disconnect between player action and game response is too great. It's too big. And that is the core problem with the inventory. But it's not the only problem. You see, it's just the problem for the players, but not for the map creators. The problem with building an inventory map is simple. How do you build a timetable for a map where some of the tracks are missing? Building a timetable is a tedious task already, and this just makes it worse because every time you try and test it, you have to build the tracks. Either that, or you need to leave in temporary tracks in the editor as placeholders that you then remove later to help you test faster, but if the tracks are already there, why would you ever want to remove them? It's just extra effort for something that players aren't likely to enjoy in the first place. Do you really think that's worth your time? Most map creators, myself included, don't. As I record this, there are only 5 levels available on the workshop that I personally know of that include the inventory. And of those 5 levels, I personally built one of them, and 2 of them were made for the level contest that specifically requires that you use the inventory in your map. It's been almost a month since the inventory was released, and some of the game's most active and best creators have had access to it for almost 2 months. Despite this, only 5 people have tried their hand at this mechanic. Well, okay, it's actually 4. 2 of the levels were made by the same person. But it's really no surprise why people aren't making these maps. It's low demand, high effort. That never bodes well. So we now know why it was added, and we now know why it doesn't work. But we can make it work, right? We're a community. We're an endless resource of people invested in map making. We're an endless resource of creativity. There's gotta be something, right? Well, of course. Every bad idea has a good use. If you read the recent Steam news article that I wrote about the second creator contest, you'll know that I've added a ton of tips there for creators to use. I thought I would take the time to repeat the most important of those suggestions here as they are quite relevant. Number 1, the less tracks that your player has to build, the better. A map such as, say, the Mandan and Oswego Railroad sucks because the player has to build everything. Due to the sheer amount of tracks the player needs to build, there is a serious disconnect between action and reward. Compare that to National Kingdom Animal Railway. I messed that up, we're leaving that in the script. In this map, the tracks are already mostly there. You just have to fine-tune the junctions to make them work, you know? Look at maps such as Growing Metropolis or Artifice City. Both of these levels start with base tracks that allow the player to start playing the level before they're really required to start building it. And when you do need to start adding connections, it's not a ton. It's just 1 or 2 new routes. Some of those routes might be a bit complex, but there's only a small handful of them at any given moment, allowing you to focus on them more without spending too much time building. And for a level like Learn S, there are no more tracks to build, only sensors and signals. As long as you have the baseline trackage, your map will probably be far better off than otherwise. Tip number 2, add a little bit of wiggle room to your timetable. Don't make it insanely strict. That way, if a player messes up on the track work that they built or the signaling that they built, they at least have a little bit of time to try and remedy their mistakes. This sort of fixes the main issue with the disconnect between action and response. Because the player is given a second action to fix their first mistakes, there is less time between the primary action and the game's response. Because now, the secondary action has become the primary action because it is more recent in the player's memory. Not only does this give them a better chance of beating the level without mistakes, it also gives them a better idea of what their mistakes were, so if they ever go back through the level to replay it, they know what to fix when they start. I think the main issue with the inventory was it was released without a game mode that was purpose-built for it. The inventory was built for timetable mode, but timetable wasn't built for the inventory. Which is why I'm glad in a recent Discord-only stream a new game mode was announced. It's one that I've personally known about for a while. In fact, I designed maps for it before signal stopping penalties were even a thing. But obviously now with the inventory in place, there's a whole new way to play the mode and a whole new way to design maps, and so I'm building new maps for this new mode. Originally code-named Dodgeball, now called Waves of Chaos and potentially called Rush Hour in the future, this new game mode addresses, and personally I believe, fixes the problems that the inventory has with timetable mode. Because this mode operates via a system of waves, where each wave gets harder adding on to the last one with more contracts for you to complete, but also rewarding you more tracks that you can build with, this mode consistently strikes the right balance between expanding your track work and your railroad and running trains. You can't run into the pitfall of building everything at once because you are required to build it in stages. While the train's route is strict, the schedule and the platforms are not. As long as the train is going to the right destinations, it doesn't really strictly care when it arrives and when it leaves. Obviously, you can't wait too long. That would make the mode too easy. but you can at least have a little bit of wiggle room. And with the platforms, the trains don't care what platform they go to as long as they are at the right station. This means the players can't route trains to the wrong platforms on accident due to faulty track designs. This game mode perfectly blends together the arcadey style of timetable and the dynamic pacing of gameplay with Endless. And I know it's going to be fun, not just because I'm building maps for it and I'm a narcissistic twat, but because I've actually had the time to play this on multiple occasions. So far, it's been an amazing experience, and I can't wait to see what this mode provides. The inventory will finally have a home where it will fit in perfectly in a new, innovative way. All in all, the inventory is a bit of a failed mechanic. It has a ton of potential, but that potential is all muddied behind a difficult learning curve, both for players and creators alike. Despite its troubled beginnings and its iffy current state, the mechanic has a promising future, and the developers have both acted on it swiftly and effectively. Update 4 is promising a new horizon for the game, even with what little information we know about it currently. And I, for one, am very excited for this. Mostly because I know this isn't the only thing that Update 4 is bringing to the table. I don't think I have permission to talk about what I know, but in the coming months, some big changes are going to happen. For now, I am most excited about Rush Hour. It fixes one of the game's most interesting, and admittedly problematic, mechanics, and it holds a lot of promise for a new way to play Railroute. For now, though, well, that second creator contest is still going on. Do you have some crazy idea on how to use the inventory? Well, why don't you submit a level? There's only a week left, so you'll have to be fast. But if you can show us a new fun way to currently use the mechanic, that would be amazing. If you want to try playing with the inventory for yourself, why don't you go check out the contest submissions, or maybe one of my own levels, Artificity. That way, you can form your own opinions on this crazy mechanic. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. I sure have. If you enjoyed this, tune in next week where we discuss more of the game's official levels, the design behind them, and why they were included. For now, however, that's all. Cheers, folks.